Lawyers of Reddit, what are the craziest yet legal last will and testament stories you had to deal with? Story 1. I worked at an attorney office and little older lady gave her house and her belongings to a bus driver. The bus driver was nice to her and would help her. We were all waiting for it to break loose when her family found out. Story 2. Military lawyer here. Had a young client come in for a will before deployment. He put a request to be buried in blue jeans, a Chris Jericho t-shirt, and his replica WWE Championship belt. Happily, this airman didn't meet any misfortune on his deployment. Story 3. Not a lawyer, but paralegal. We had a dying client in hospital change her will by recording it on a smartphone. It set a precedent and made the local paper. The lawyer in question has the page from the newspaper framed in his office. Story 4. The Great Stork Derby was when a wealthy Canadian left a substantial amount of money to whichever woman had the most children in the 10 years following his death. It was upheld through numerous court battles and 4 women tied with 9 children each. 2 women were also given smaller payouts. One had 10 children, 2 were stillborn, and another had more than 9 kids, but a few were illegitimate. The guy also had some other interesting things in his will and was a known practical joker. Story 5. Where I went to college, there's an oak tree that was deeded to itself in a man's will, now called the tree that owns itself. It sits in the middle of a road and you have to go to one lane to drive around it. Story is that a man loved the tree so much as a kid, that around the time he died in the 1830s, he gave the tree possession of itself. This technically wouldn't stand up in a court of law, but the county and local populace has accepted it and takes care of it. The original tree actually died and the current one is a product of one of the acorns of the original. Story 6. I work for a lawyer who does wills. We've had a lady put in her will that one of her adult sons was not to receive his share until he visited a dentist and the other son lost 70 pounds. Another lady put in her will that she wanted her cats cremated with her when she died. Told her that's not going to happen. Human remains and animal remains do not get cremated at once. So she settled on cremated separately and joined together, then buried together. Typically wills are about 10 pages for the average person. We had a lady who had a 56-page will. She detailed everything from her house to people wooden ladle to toilet paper holder to magazine basket to etc. For every single item in this lattice house, we had a man put in his will that his family was to go to the zoo immediately after his burial that day. We thought that was more heartwarming. We had a lady that told us to put in her will that she wanted to be buried on her property next to her husband. She lived on a small rural property, totally illegal to have human remains buried there, refused to tell us whether her husband was cremated or not and had dictated that she did not want to be cremated. Her husband had died 5 or 6 years prior. So it's not as though it was 50 years where things like that may have been a little overlooked. We work with many people from a certain religion. A lot of people we do wills for leave at least 90 of their estates to the church instead of their families. Story 7. 2 sons of really wealthy couple go to the family lawyer to have the will read. Lawyer is super nervous. He has known them both since they were kids. One son gets the entire inheritance and the other gets nothing. The explanation was that it should be passed through to blood relatives only, so that was the day he found out he was adopted. A lot of people asked what happened. I only heard of this through a friend so I don't have the full story, but the reason it went to a lawyer, the person I know, was that it was being contested, so the disinherited son had to contest. I believe over the amount, not that his brother wasn't willing to give him anything crazy. Story 8. There was a case study in law school involving a man who was crushed to death by a tractor. He wrote his will in the tractor tire as he lay dying. The entire tractor wheel was then filed with the county register's office. I guess it was a fender. The fender is still on display. Story 9. My dad is a lawyer and a friend of my grandpa, who was in his 80s and had end-stage cancer, made his will. He was a big fan of weapons and wanted to give them to my dad. He's a fan too. He left him 2 shotguns, a Glock and a revolver. My dad told him it would be better to write it in the will because my country's law says you can only own 5 weapons at a time. My dad had already 4 at the time, so he would have to give some up, but if you inherit them, it doesn't add to the limit. So they made a testament and he gave him the weapons except for the revolver. Because it was his favorite and didn't want to give it away yet. My dad instantly knew why but didn't say anything. 2 weeks later the guy shot himself. With the revolver, he still hasn't got the revolver because police still has it. He never told my grandpa that he knew, but he didn't want to take this guy's chance of ending his life on his own terms instead of waiting for the cancer to win. Story 10. Not a lawyer, but I had an experience with this years ago. Rich uncle of mine, real crazy, not in the good way. He would come to visit us when we were kids maybe once every 10 years. Last time he did, he brought us to a Denny's. He met my brother in an airport, was there for an hour before he got on another plane and went home. When he died he had no friends. He had driven his wife to basically drink herself to death a few years prior. He left his entire estate to an Elvis impersonator, everything. Story 11. There's a famous UK case. One of the richest men in the world at the time died during the journey between his solicitor and his country estate, all because he forgot his glasses. Took lawyers just over 100 years to spend the entire estate in legal fees. The name of the case escapes me. Story 12. I was a witness to one where the lady wanted to make sure her daughter divorced her husband when she had no intentions of doing so if she wanted her part of the estate. Thankfully that is not legally enforceable, so nothing came from it. Story 13. This large French farmer's family had been fighting each other for 15 years over their parents' estate. Everything and anything had been a weapon in this all-out war. Debts, spoils, barns, plots, cows, wills and whatever. Defeats followed victories. Failures followed compromises, but progress was being made, and at some point the killing zone turned to a standstill. Everything was agreed as long as no one talked antics, jewelry, furnitures, kitchenware, photographs, laundry or tools. A long protracted period ensued, any goodwill tentative harshly discouraged before even being aired. Time went on with no issue in sight. Then someone suggested they just drag all the stuff into the farm's courtyard, pour petrol on it, and set it all afire. Everyone agreed. Story 14. My brother used to be a paralegal, and he said that a group of 3 siblings, I believe 2 brothers and a sister, almost came to blows because the inheritance didn't divide into 3 evenly. There were 2 pennies left over. Story 15. Estate lawyer here. I could tell so many stories. Sisters fighting over deceased brother's dining room table, ending in an accusation that one had murdered her own husband. True believers who were convinced the rapture was imminent and only saw the value of completing their estate plan when I explained the mess those of us left behind would have to deal with, including their stuff. A guy who got married days before his death to a longtime girlfriend, long story, did a will, disinherited several kids but not all, and somehow everything worked out okay with minimal disagreement. Several stories where a family member is a lawyer who practices in another area of law in another state or doesn't practice at all. Guaranteed craziness. I could go on and on. It's the absolute best line of work, super fulfilling, great stories, get to know families, and walk meaningful paths alongside them. Story 16. I mean, it's not that crazy, it's depressingly predictable. Rich old aunt, the only one in her huge family with any money, having been a doctor on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, she set up a living trust to take care of her poor relations in the Philippines, to continue as a death trust whenever she died. Her favorite niece was in control of the trust, and of course the niece was responsible and even-handed and never ever embezzled any of the money to set herself up as a newspaper publisher and concert producer and media mogul with new expensive cars and lots of first-class Pan-Pacific travel. Nope, not her. Haha, of course the trustee did all that. Hundreds of thousands of dollars missing, and an unholy mess of sifting through money transfers and property purchases in 3 countries. The niece also had a bigamous marriage to some loser in the Philippines. Her legal husband in North America was bedridden and dying slowly, to whom she sent buckets of her aunt's money to build a luxury villa. She vehemently denied such a relationship existed. She also had photos of the wedding on her Facebook page. Not the smartest embezzler out there. From where I sat, in the attorney's office representing the poor relations trying to stop the trustee's embezzlement, the craziest part of it all was that after years of fighting, we finally got complete financial disclosure for the trust on like December 22nd, and it was such a Christmas miracle that I almost put off my Christmas trip to NYC to gleefully pore through every poorly redacted line of it. Also, we had the rich old aunt's ashes sitting on our bookshelf for years, since the dispute about what to do with her remains was part of it all. Story 17. Steady Ed Hedrick, the inventor of the Frisbee, had his ashes melted into some Frisbees. Not a lawyer, just a guy who grew up in California throwing the things. Story 18. Not a lawyer, but I have a crazy story. My grandma's sister was a narcissist and extremely vindictive. She and her husband gained a significant number of assets over the years, including a somewhat profitable farm with over 100 acres of fields. They had a few children, all boys, and they all had wives and children of their own. Her husband died about 6 years before she did. Somehow, in their 50 years of marriage and living on said farm, had they never bothered to go to a lawyer and write a will. Instead, she wrote a note and left it in their safe of legal documents saying that nothing was to go to wife of son who died almost 20 years ago or her children, and said aunt's grandchildren. This, because the son's wife was more outspoken and wouldn't be controlled by her, and absolutely despised her and my entire family too. So everything went into probate, and the kids are still trying to get everything squared away a year later, but the people she wanted excluded should be getting something out of it too. Story 19. The local newspaper ran a story with pictures of a house that was left to a cat when the owner died. The cat was the only occupant. The woman's lawyer maintained the house for the cat from the deceased owner's trust fund. I always wondered if there might have been a little motivation to hasten Kitty's demise. Story 20. Not so much the original will itself, but the aftermath and greed of the siblings. Almost none of them talk anymore. 10x total. They're fighting over a couple hundred acres, most of which is swamp. The greed part is they had the original will amended. Every grandkid was supposed to get a portion in the original will along with the siblings. However, the siblings nixed that via courts. They were going to then split the property among themselves, but the executor just didn't give a and let it sit for 30 years without doing. The rest wanted it done, so court cases, massive debts. Finally the executor no longer has control. Thanks to the court cases, the property was in massive debt, which is sort of paid off right now, and now they are all too old or dead to do anything with it. If the will had gone through as originally stated, the family, which consists of about 35 grandchildren, would have all been happy there or had money for selling the property, which is worth about $35,000 a lot. Now it's probably just going to go under eventually for non-payment. Even if I could buy some of it for cheap, I'm not touching it with 100-mile pole. Story 21. Fairly new lawyer. Haven't had that much in wills. Area's family is where the real fun is, but did have a woman with dementia come in to do her will, then come in a few months later to change it, because her condition was worsening. I did a capacity assessment and she seemed to understand what her old will said, what her new will would say, why she was changing it, wasn't suddenly cutting anyone close out. So I made the changes, told her okay, but warned her that I might not be able to make future changes due to concerns about her condition. A week later she comes back in and she's in rough shape. She remembers me but her eyes are watering. She has some trouble explaining what's going on. I realize she's not even trying to change her will, she's just sort of here because she's scared about the changes in her head. So I get in touch with the person supposed to be caring for her. I talk over her will one more time. I tell her she's done everything right, her will is safe, her family knows where it is, etc. When I said goodbye I told her I hope to see her again, and she smiled and said she didn't think we would. I teared up a little. Wed laughed and chatted through her original will, discussed the best ways to do things, seeing this formerly confident and witty woman, still keeping it together but obviously so concerned and knowing it was a one-way downward path. It sucked. I don't know how she's doing now. Story 22. Not a lawyer, but when my dad was growing up there was this little old lady across the street without any family. She was from Finland and her husband died during WW2, she immigrated to the States and had no one, so my grandparents would knock on her door to chat, take her grocery shopping, etc. They made my dad and brother help out around her houseyard, etc. She loved my dad and uncle, treated them like her own kids, cookies and treats and presents. When Dad was in Vietnam, she would record him voice messages on tapes and send them to him with letters telling him what life was like in the neighborhood and how she hoped he'd be home safe soon, that she prayed for him, etc. When he came home, he'd stop by to chat and help out around the house, bring her macaroons and just sit and talk for a while. One day MS. Lingard died and a lawyer called my grandparents. She had left them a sizable amount of cash in stock, and her paid-off house to my dad and his brother. My family had thought she was penniless. Never underestimate how much little simple things can mean to people. You just might be one of the best things in their life. Story 23. I annal, but my school lucked into its art museum because of William Ackland's crazy will. He donated a ton of money to Duke for an art museum, on the condition that he be buried in the museum. Duke noped out of that little clause in the money, so UNC happily accepted the gift, built the Ackland Art Center, and you can go see his tomb right there in it. I enjoy sharing this fun little piece of trivia when I give tours. Story 24. I was in rehab with a guy whose grandmother left him $5 million if he could quit heroin for 2 years. He would have to wear one of those drug patches that the courts use for probationers the entire time, which are exceptionally hard to fool. $5 million. Slam dunk, right? This was 2007. Last time I saw him was in 2013, knotted the out in a Fleabag motel. While I left to pick up another sack, I got arrested. Made the decision to quit and never saw him again. Who knows, maybe since then he's cleaned up. Story 25. This family didn't realize I had nothing to do with the will. One kept telling me to tell the deceased they were unhappy with their decisions. Another thanked me personally for gifting them the house. Story 26. My grandpa gave all his belongings to my father, which was the youngest of 4 brothers and 3 sisters while my grandma was still alive. Grandpa told my dad that he gave him everything rightfully because he believed my dad will split everything equal. Grandma wanted her property back. Dad at the time only 20 obeyed his mom. Big f***ing court case several years later between all the brothers because it was indeed not evenly split. Still going strong to this day with no grandma around anymore. Grandpa was a wise man, just miscalculated. Story 27. I had a guy want to give his car to his daughter, and split his 3 accounts with his son and daughter. I've only done one and I probably won't do any more, lol. Story 28. I'm not a lawyer but I have a sad story that fit here. My great-grandmother and grandfather had a will that would give their 6 kids a fair share when they both were dead. But my grandfather passed and the oldest of the kids that took it to court to get his part, even if the will said that they would get their share when both were dead. This made my great-grandmother lose everything. She didn't get to handle the sorrow of losing her husband whom she'd been married to for 68 years. Instead she had to go to court many times and then she lost the house they had built and almost everything she owned. We helped her get an apartment and tried to keep her happy. She deteriorated quickly after those months. I hate how someone can let the greed come between families. I've never met the... Story 29. Not a lawyer, but the Huguette Clark story is utterly fascinating to me. She died in 2011 at age 104. She was a wealthy recluse daughter of a copper baron who hadn't seen any family since her mother passed away, in 1963. She lived the last 20 years of her life in a hospital in Manhattan, having contact with only a handful of people, and rarely had face-to-face interactions. Of her $300 million fortune, she gave most to charity including her palatial estates, $30 million to her longtime nurse, $1 million to the hospital, money to the caretakers of said palatial estates, her accountant and lawyer, and nothing to her distant relatives. Except all that was written in her second will, which was written 6 weeks after the first. Hey race, a detailed story about the legal battle. Story 30. I have a grandpa who set up his will to divide his estate between his and his wife's remarried families. Pretty normal so far. Stupid part is that rather than splitting his half between the 3 children, he did per capita, to be distributed after his wife passes. So we currently have a 9-way split, and likely 10 to 15 ways before it's actually settled. Story 31. Not a lawyer, but this a will story my great-aunt told me. It's basically just a lot of jealousy and family drama. I'm not good at telling stories so please bear with me. There was an old woman, we will refer to her as Granny or G so I don't have to keep saying old woman. Granny was a sweet old lady, relatively healthy but had some trouble getting around and taking care of herself. Her family was the typical greedy and money-hungry scenario, only calling when they wanted something, I don't know the full story involving the family, but they stuck her in a nursing home and moved far away. To everyone's knowledge, Granny had very little money, but she still owned her property, a small house her best friend my GA took care of, and her car, a customized classic VW Bug. The nursing home had volunteers, people to come and talk to the residents, play board games with them, basically keep them occupied. Granny's favorite was a newer volunteer, a 19-year-old girl who we'll refer to as V. I only met her a handful of times, but V was a very soft-spoken and kind girl. V was the only volunteer Granny liked, because they had many things in common, one of those things being their mutual love for a specific kind of car, hint hint. Over the next year and a half, V continued to volunteer about twice a week. Soon, Granny started to get sick, her health started to rapidly decline. Did her family come to see her? Nope, until her last days. She only had V and my GA. Granny died. Some of her family came to the funeral, but pretty much everyone only cared about the will. My GA said that the only ones who seemed sad at the funeral were herself, V, and a few of Granny's old friends. When it came time to read the will, there was a big shock. It turned out Granny had a decent amount of money stashed away, about 10,000. The family had no idea. Only my great-aunt knew about it. A small amount of that was split up and given to select family members, but the rest was divided and given to my great-aunt, and Vivi was in complete shock. The family was mad. A few other things were given to family, select items that didn't hold a whole lot of value, but it was about to get worse. The car I mentioned earlier, the classic Bug, Granny's teenage granddaughter had her eyes on that car since Granny was put in the nursing home. Everyone expected her to get it once G passed. That didn't happen though. Like I said, one of the things V and G bonded over was their love for bugs. G had shown V lots of pictures of her Bug, and V enthusiastically told G all about her own Bug. My great-aunt wasn't really a fan of the car. I like trucks, and she said that she and Granny discussed leaving the Bug to V in the will, which is exactly what G did. If the family was mad about the money, they were furious about this car. I've seen pictures. This thing was nice. Granny probably loved it more than anything, maybe even my great-aunt, and according to her, V cried her eyes out, like she had to leave the room. She told my GA, I can't accept it. I'm not family. That car should be yours. And my GA spent over an hour and a half convincing her that G wanted her to have it. Some family members followed V outside and started screaming at her, threatening to sue her, claiming it was part of a plan V must have created. What? Befriend a lonely old woman and take her fortune, telling her she didn't deserve any of what she got and calling her awful things. One of the calmer relatives got things settled down and my GA got V out of there. It's been a few years, my great-aunt and V still talk, and V still has Granny's Bug, as far as I know. After the reading of the will was over, V got a lot of nasty messages online but was otherwise fine. One of the family members did contact a lawyer, but they must have told them there was nothing that could be done since V never actually got sued or anything. Story 32, I read a will that was pretty normal up until the decedent asked that his cremated ashes be sprinkled on the crotches of well-endowed teenage boys. Maybe he was trying to be funny. Story 33, I have heard that if a charity is a recipient of a will, they will sometimes send lawyers to make sure that all the accounting is done to ensure their share is the full size granted, in effect trying up probate for years and greatly increasing costs. Lawyers suggested instead only granting charities a specific account to avoid the problems. Any truth to that? Story 34, there was a case story from someone who was in law school of a generational trust. This says, all my grandchildren get when the youngest reaches the age of 25, the youngest grandchild was 24, and they were all making plans for their inheritance. Plot twist, one of the sons remarried, and had a baby and new heir when the other grandchildren were 24, so they had to wait until they were 50 to inherit. Edit, I asked if the baby had a bodyguard, and my friend didn't know. I think one of the grandchildren was in law school and was a classmate of my friend, who told me the story. This was in the 1990s, I believe. Story 35, don't practice in this area, but just thought I should mention that wills blow and can easily be flawed and possibly wholly or in part be void for minor imperfections. Example, some states require that the two witnesses actually see him or her sign it, whereas others only require them to be in the same room and aware that it was signed. Long story short, just do a trust instead. Story 36, not in the will, but my mother left her estate to me, and my 4 brothers, share and share alike. My oldest brother was physically and mentally disabled. A few days before she died, she asked one of my other brothers to have all of us turn our shares over to my disabled brother. Keep in mind he was getting disability, lived in a nice group home, had all of his medical covered, and risked losing this if he had any substantial assets. Also, my brother who spoke to my mother asked that the money be put into an irrevocable trust. This means that if my brother passed, the money would go to the state of Pennsylvania. My brother was in very poor health, and my mother's wishes were never codified into her written will. We met for a breakfast meeting, me, and my 3 other brothers, and 2 of us agreed to the trust, and me, and another brother did not. There was no bad blood, and we all respected each other's decisions. While my brother was in the process of setting up the trust, our disabled brother died of natural causes related to this disability. 2 of us had chosen to not make an emotional decision in the wake of my mother's death, and in the end, her wishes never came to fruition because of my brother's death, but if we had all agreed to these wishes, the state of Pennsylvania would have made out like a bandit. Worse yet, I have an adult disabled daughter, and was much more fluent in the ins and outs of providing for a disabled child. I didn't want to come across as greedy or mean, but I knew what the irrevocable trust meant, and they didn't. Story 37. Not a lawyer, but I used to work at a bank in the estates department. I was an administrator who had to manage the files including encroachments upon the capital I.e., I want to take some money out now, please. I had this one account multi-million-dollar trust for one single beneficiary, the son of the deceased. What's interesting is that the son killed the parents, with a hammer in grotesque and brutal fashion. He pleaded insanity. He would call once a year from the penitentiary mental hospital, requesting 50 for commissary to buy chips and gum. The call was always strange. He was very polite, very doped up. The quality of the call was always very tinny, like he was far away from the phone. Story 38. My grandfather's will had several conditions for our inheritance. Most were kind of out there. The will was broken into several sections. The first section dealt with the estate itself, basically all of the financial parts. My grandfather spent his life in finance and investing. The following sections broke down by family member dealt with the belongings. There wasn't much left because most of it had been given out after my grandmother died many years ago, but 99 of it was all sentimental stuff that would have gone to that person anyway. The other one were things we wouldn't have thought of that he wanted to go to certain people. However, those sections all contained a ton of requirements for each individual that ranged from heartwarming. I remember my uncle being required to remain the upright loving person he had always been to the absurd. For example, my parents were both required to remain left-handed. The only thing I received or really cared about was a 1932 Philco radio that was the first radio I had ever restored when I was like 10. I was required to promise that I'd keep the old beast as he called it running as long as I owned it. My daughter received a music box from my grandmother's large collection that had always been her favorite growing up on the grounds. She remains the eldest biological great-granddaughter. She's still to date the only great-grandchild. She also received a couple of puzzles that she had helped him with when we had visited a few times before his death, again on the grounds that she actually finished the damn things because he had never gotten around to it. Actual wording from the will: leave it to my grandfather to give us a reason to laugh after his death. Story 39. When I was in law school, a professor of mine told me about her brother who'd been left $800,001 by a pensioner at the church where he was a vicar. Obviously the family contested it, but being the monastic man he wanted to keep it. Story 40. A relative from my dad's side didn't get married to have a life to care for her sick mother. She lived with her while all her 5 siblings went to live their lives and got their own homes. They all said, throughout their lives, that when the mother died this daughter would get the house since she was the only one caring for her. When the mother died, all the siblings got their share. She didn't have any money to buy hers, so she was literally thrown out on the street, after caring for their mother all her life. And despite all of them having their own homes, my dad doesn't talk to that part of the family anymore. Story 41. I admit this is a tangent, but I'm reminded of a guy who bought an elderly woman's French apartment by agreeing to pay a certain amount monthly until she died. Win-win, right? She gets cash to spend while she's alive while keeping the apartment, and he gets the apartment for cheap because she's old and won't live long. Except that she outlives him. The kicker is that his widow had to continue to pay her. Had she outlived his widow, his children would have to continue to pay. Story here. Story 42. My will stipulates that all my assets are to go to the niece or nephew that wins a treasure hunt that will be set up. Thought that would be more fun. Story 43. Not a lawyer, a financial advisor. A woman left about $1,000,000 to her horse. My client is a horse. We manage his investments. The sister of the deceased pulls out about 3 to 4 annually to care for the beneficiary of the trust. Story 44. Not a layer. My grandfather's will was fairly normal as my gram is still alive and received most of it. There was one snag though. One of his witnesses, a paralegal at the time, killed her husband. That caused some complications. Beyond that, and one of the recipients having died before my grandfather, everything went fairly well. Story 45. My ex-wife said if I was with another woman after her death I would not get the proceeds of her will, and she was adamant. An attorney said that was okay. Well, if you think about it, the will would be in situ forever if I didn't have a girlfriend. In case I did at some point, she didn't get the logic. Story 46. My sister and I bought a house from an old lady who was leaving everything to the Doberman estate, so a charity supporting German war dogs. I suppose they need care as much as any other creature. Story 47. When my uncle passed away, his stepdaughter, who is a paralegal, went and completely changed his will without his permission and left everything to herself. She was obviously caught, but what a piece of. Story 48. Not a lawyer, but heard this great story. Really wealthy religious Jew dies. They read his will, and in it he asks to be buried in his socks. Jewish law prohibits this, and the family was perplexed because he was a learned man. After much deliberation, the rabbis concluded that he cannot be buried in his socks. The family was distraught that they could not fulfill his final wish. Later on they find a letter written by the man. The letter says, I was a wealthy man and had everything I could have asked for, but when I died even my socks couldn't go with me. Know what's really important in life. Story 49. There are a lot of stories of people leaving someone a sock or a penny or something else dumb, so they can't argue that they were supposed to be on the will but forgotten. Story 50. This thread makes me curious to see what my father's will is like. I figure almost everything will probably go to his brother, my uncle, but I can't help but wonder if I'm absent from the will or specifically written to get nothing. Story 51. Not a lawyer, etc. When my father was drawing up his will, he had each of us pick one thing from his estate we wanted and gave them out as gifts to us. Then there was nothing sentimental left. He made his will with everything being divided equally amongst all heirs with this exception: at the time of his death anyone who was in jail or rehab could not receive anything. Their share would be divided amongst everyone else. Story 52 Disclaimer: this was a story told to me by an estate's attorney. Deceased's father's son was a prior client of the attorney. Son did not really talk his father but wanted to make sure estate was wrapped up properly. They did not know if a will existed but knew dad had a safety deposit box. Get a court order to open the box and sure enough a will was in there. The will though left a lion's share of his estate, maybe a few $1,000s to a woman who no one knew. In with the will were also pictures of a woman and a stage name something like Cinnamon or Candy, written on the back. They were able to put two and two together and realized that the father had left part of his estate to a stripper who he enjoyed visiting in his older age. She had no idea and they had to track her down, which was also a nightmare, I'm told. They finally found her and she came to the office for a check accompanied by a male friend. Lawyer assumes he was a pimp. She ended up receiving, as I mentioned above, a few thousand, but it always got me how the old guy left photos of her to help identify her. Story 53 Not a lawyer, but had a fun story with my grandma's brother's will. For the last 10 to 15 years he had been paying child support and sending money to this lady who he said was his girlfriend and the child they had together. For years his other children and my grandma had been trying to convince him that the girl was obviously not his. The girlfriend would appear only on payday and stay the bare minimum. The girl called another guy dad and had his last name. The girlfriend insisted he was her friend, but the other children found out he lived with her and all. It was obvious to everyone, except my great uncle who we believe was just happy for a nice-looking lady to visit him. He paid for their whole lives, house, school, vacations. The day he died she was the first one at the door. He left her and her kid one each, with a note saying he had given them their inheritance while alive. Now reading this I wonder if his oldest son actually cheated and got his will changed. I hope not. It was well deserved and my grandma loves to tell how her brother came to his senses at the end.